Leo Strauss opened the door in our Cartesian world to a classical, both ancient and medieval, understanding of faith, and so of reason. Leo Strauss confronts an audience that has been raised in a Cartesian environment, in Cartesian terms. What are these terms? What do they boil down to? They boil down to a dichotomy. The Cartesian world is a dichotomous world. The fundamental dichotomy that Leo Strauss addresses is the one between reason and faith. Now, as a scholar of medieval scholarship, Leo Strauss was quite familiar with the principle of fides quaerens intellectum, faith seeking understanding. This principle is obscured by modern scholarship and its forefathers. So Leo Strauss returns to these fathers of modernity, unpacks them for us, shows us that they're wrong, ultimately, that they misrepresent classical antiquity and the Middle Ages, and thereby helps us return to a classical understanding of fundamental problems, a way of relating ourselves to these problems, of living in the face of these problems. Now, when it comes to the problem of the relationship between faith and reason, Leo Strauss returns preliminarily to Spinoza. Why Spinoza? Spinoza as student of Machiavelli. Spinoza, after all, had referred to Machiavelli as vir acutissimus, which is to say as a most perspicacious, acute gentleman. What is at stake here? Spinoza frames faith in a way that helps Spinoza prop up a new understanding of reason, and so of freedom. Today we speak of, and we've been speaking of for a few centuries now, of free thinkers. We are free to the extent that we rid ourselves of the cumbersome weight of obedience, right? Of faith, of authority. So freedom is a kind of free-floating entity cut off from or separated from, alienated, and one might say, but otherwise emancipated from the dictates, the demands of classical authority. In Kant's terms, man chooses his own authority. He is autonomous. He is an autonomous, rational being. He's a mens. He is a res cogitans, a mind that defines its own duties. This mind is symbolically universal. Spinoza sets the stage for this Kantian assertion. What does Spinoza say, in effect? He says that the Bible, he picks on the Hebrew Bible, but his main target is the Christian. The Bible forces reason into a cage. Now, reason can free itself from this cage by showing the limitations of biblical authority, the historical, existential limitations by framing, therefore, the Bible in historical terms, in existential terms. We can study the context of the Bible, frame it, and make good use of the Bible. And by good, we mean useful to modern reason. Let us look at some statements by Leo Strauss on these questions. At the end of his preface to Spinoza's Critique of Religion, Leo Strauss writes of the situation we confront today. With respect to Spinoza, we inherit a way of relating to problems from Spinoza. What is modern reason all about? Leo Strauss points to modernity as an unfolding of a message. Modern reason is all about coping with the misery of man without God, the death of God. In the face of the death of God, we have framed God in historical terms, in existential terms. We have explored the context of God's garden, and we've seen that God is a kind of illusion or delusion. Now, we have to face what is beyond God. And so we will need a new fortitude, not grounded in God. What about this new fortitude? What is it grounded in? Well, it turns out that it's grounded in a kind of vortex. But let us see what Strauss has to say. This new fortitude being the willingness to look man's forsakenness in its face, being the courage to welcome the most terrible truth,
is probity, intellectual probity.
This final atheism with a good conscience. And so here he's referring also to Nietzsche. Or with a bad conscience. It doesn't matter. Is distinguished from the atheism at which the past shuddered by its conscientiousness. So, we don't simply have opposition to the gods. We have a facing of what is beyond God, what is assumed to be beyond God, based on a Spinozist conception of God. Compared not only with Epicureanism, but with the belief of the age of Spinoza, so early modern Enlightenment, it reveals itself as a descendant of biblical morality. So we have a new religion. This atheism, the heir and the judge of the belief in revelation, of the secular struggle between belief and unbelief. Now let us keep that in mind. This is a modern Cartesian position, framework. You either believe or don't believe. And finally, of the short-lived, but by no means, therefore, inconsequential, romantic longing for the lost belief, confronting orthodoxy in complex sophistication, formed out of gratitude, rebellion, longing, and indifference, and in simple probity, is according to its claim as capable of an original understanding of the human roots of the belief in God as no earlier, no less complex, simple philosophy ever was. So we have, ultimately, by the end of modernity, of this unfolding, we have the final lesson, or the the core lesson of modernity exposed. The last word and ultimate justification of Spinoza's critique is the atheism from intellectual probity, which overcomes orthodoxy radically by understanding it radically. That is, without the polemical bitterness of the Enlightenment and the equivocal reverence of Romanticism. So with Romanticism we have a dreaming of all that antiquity, classical antiquity, and the Middle Ages stood for, ultimately. This dream is, however, of course, as a dream, allows for the modern framing, modern grounding, and so fundamentally acceptance of the correctness, the validity of modern insights. Yet this claim, however eloquently raised, cannot deceive one about the fact that it is, that its basis is an act of will, of belief, and that being based on belief is fatal to any philosophy. Modern reason is based on belief. Nietzsche exposes the essence of modern freedom as derivative from classical religiosity, religion, classical authority. It is, we might say, even parasitic on it. The victory of orthodoxy through the self-destruction of rational philosophy was not an unmitigated blessing. So, what do we have here? We have a kind of return to orthodoxy. How does this happen? It happens where we face the essence or the ground of modern reason. Modern reason sees itself as destined to be itself. We're destined to be free. Destined by what source, what cause, what motive, what motor? Not a God compatible with biblical morality, but a kind of mechanism, a machine, a vortex. Not an unmitigated blessing, for it was a victory not of Jewish orthodoxy, but of any orthodoxy. Well, yes, because it is not tied to any discrete tradition. It has no supreme representation in classical antiquity. The supreme representation is offered by the essence of modern reason, which turns out to be an act of the will, of belief also. And so it involves the destruction of classical philosophy, of rational philosophy. Rejecting the Jewish orthodoxy based, which is based or bases its claim, here we're paraphrasing, to superiority to other religions from the beginning on its superior rationality. So, classical Jewish orthodoxy understands itself as being more rational than other orthodoxies. What does this mean? It means that it involves an authority an understanding of authority that is compatible with freedom, more compatible than other forms of orthodoxy. Apart from this, the hierarchy of moralities and wills to which the final atheism referred could not but be claimed to be intrinsically true, theoretically true. The will to power of the strong or of the weak may be the ground of every other doctrine. It is not the ground of the doctrine of the will to power. The will to power was said to be a fact. Right? So that's the context. That is the true foundation of every orthodoxy. So we have a universal orthodoxy now that can make use, expediential use of all other orthodoxies, of course, and even hide itself behind other orthodoxies. Other observations and experiences confirmed the suspicion that it would be unwise to say farewell to reason. This is Strauss, reflecting on the situation. It would be unwise to say farewell to reason. I began, autobiographically here writing, I began therefore to wonder whether the destruction of reason was not the inevitable outcome of modern rationalism as distinguished from pre-modern rationalism, especially Jewish medieval rationalism and its classical Aristotelian and Platonic foundation. Here we have the door open to the classics. The present study was based on the premise, sanctioned by powerful prejudice, that a return to pre-modern philosophy is impossible. The change of orientation, which found its first expression, not entirely by accident, in the article published at the end of this volume, etc., compelled me to engage in a number of studies in the course of which I became ever more attentive to the manner in which heterodox thinkers of earlier ages wrote their books. As a consequence of this, I now read the theological political treatise differently than I read it when I was young. I understood Spinoza too literally because I did not read him literally enough. What does Strauss mean by this? Well, he had assumed that a return to classical philosophy was impossible. Now he understands that it's possible, and therefore he understands Spinoza better. Well, he had assumed that Spinoza took it for granted that a return was impossible, and that therefore, in some respect, Spinoza was right. Now he sees why Spinoza spoke the way he did. He spoke the way he did to cover up the possibility of a return. Leo Strauss sees that possibility, highlights it for us by exposing the bankruptcy of modern reason, of modern rationalism. Modern rationalism presents itself as a kind of fatality, as the consequence of the bankruptcy of earlier reason. It frames authority in a way that prefaces the advent of modern reason. In this respect, it acts not entirely unlike what certain Christians believe to be Christianity, namely a self-serving enterprise that appeals to classical sources, most notably classical Greek and Roman philosophy, Greek especially, and, of course, the Hebrew Bible, to prop itself up as a synthesis. This is what modern reason does, and it ends up with bankruptcy. In other words, exposing finally what it's all about, namely a will to power, namely a will, an act of, as Strauss points it out, an act of will, of belief. And Strauss says, no. Philosophy cannot be based on belief. This makes sense. Unfortunately, many who have followed Strauss nominally, many fans, many enthusiasts, have misread him as a Spinozist, as an advocate of modern reason, modern rationalism and science. This is very unfortunate. Although it is to be expected given the weight of Cartesian influences on us, the way we are raised. We come to Strauss on the basis of Cartesian prejudices that are hard to expose. It's hard for us to think them through, to bring them into question. So we read Strauss on the basis of assumptions that we do not question. And so these assumptions frame our reading of Strauss, and at the end of the day, Strauss becomes a Cartesian, like us. So we must ignore, radically refrain the most glaring arguments by Strauss in favor of a return to classical rationalism. What happens then? Faith is no longer fides querens intellectum. Faith as trust open to the understanding, that seeks understanding, that asks for understanding. Faith now is mere belief as opposed to unbelief. And unbelief is open to truth, and belief is open to authority. This is a pathetic framework that Spinoza advocates to cover up an original problem, theological, political problem. He covers it up, he conceals it, to show that no, we can't go back. And we can't go back given the way he frames the question. So, does Strauss advocate a Cartesian understanding of faith? Faith is belief. Obviously not. That means that faith is something that is ultimately compatible, most compatible with what Strauss is all about. Is faith something on its own, autonomous? You don't need reason. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. Faith is opening to the understanding. It is this disclosure of reason properly understood. As reason is no longer constructive. It is no longer a kind of machine that functions on the basis of belief, but an illumination, a phenomenological illumination that belongs to, it is natural reason, that belongs to the very nature of things. Reason is the illumination of things in their order, their natural order, and so an illumination of the genesis of things, of the coming into being. It is a return. It is a return to the source. Things returning to their source. Things, then we have to see what does that mean. And this articulation of meaning is part and parcel of this return. All right, well, so much for an introduction to Strauss. Hopefully, we will have seen here that Strauss is not a modern rationalist, that he is not a Nietzschean, a Spinozist, Machiavellian for that matter, that he can help us return to an understanding of authority that is compatible with reason, and an understanding of reason that is compatible with certainly divine authority.